The fire had long burned out, but the warmth still clung to the stones beneath his boots. In the heart of a brutal winter, one mountain man cracked the code to nighttime heat, not with firewood, but with the earth itself. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this inspire you, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next frontier tale. The wind clawed at the chinks between logs, dragging icy breath into the cabin like a thief prying through cracks. Inside, Silas Crowley hunched near the fire, boots steaming from half-melted snow, watching the flames sink lower with every breath. He had already burned through 3 armfuls of split pine since sundown, and still the cold pressed in, slow and certain as death. Outside, Idaho's winter lay thick and mean. A silence so total it rang in your ears, the kind of silence only snow and solitude can shape. This was his 7th winter in the wilderness, long enough to know the rules, long enough to grow tired of playing them. A man could trap all day, skin and stretch until his hands bled, but if his fire went out at midnight, he'd wake up frozen, stiff by morning. It didn't matter how many furs he piled on the bed or how tight he sealed the windows. Once the fire died, the cold seeped in, through the floor, through the bones, through the breath. Silas stared at the flames like they owed him something. The logs snapped, hissed, offered their final heat. He tossed on one more, a thick split from the heart of a pine tree felled months earlier, but he knew it wouldn't last. By dawn the cabin would be cold again, the floor like stone, and his hands so stiff he'd fumble the first trap he touched. He wasn't an inventor. He wasn't even clever, by most measures. Just a stubborn man with a long beard, a longer fuse, and too many nights spent waiting for firelight to last longer than it could. But that night something shifted. It happened in a glance. He dropped a small coal that rolled out of the hearth, came to rest against one of the flat stones he'd placed there for cooking. The coal hissed, but didn't cool. Hours later, long after the flames had gone out, Silas stirred awake to drink from the water bucket and stepped onto that same stone. It was still warm, not hot, not glowing, but warm, like an ember held in the skin of the earth itself. He crouched down in the dark, bare fingers brushing the surface. The other stones were cold. Only the one where the coal had rested still held heat. It shouldn't have meant anything. A man freezing in the dark makes stories out of anything. But Silas Crowley didn't sleep again that night. He sat by the hearth, staring at the stones, asking questions he didn't yet have words for. By morning, the fire was dead, but an idea, small, strange, stubborn, had begun to burn. It wasn't just cold that winter. It was the kind of cold that carved through leather and bone, the kind that made breath freeze before it hit the ground. And on the 3rd night of the January freeze, Silas nearly didn't wake up. He'd fallen asleep close to the hearth, wrapped in his thickest buffalo robe. The fire had been strong at first. He'd fed it hard before bedding down. But the wind had changed some time past midnight. The draft through the doorframe got meaner. By the time dawn spilled its gray light across the horizon, the fire had burned itself to ash, and the air inside the cabin had gone still and bitter. Silas coughed himself awake. His chest ached. His fingertips were numb and waxy, and when he reached for the water bucket by the door, he found a solid block of ice inside the cabin. He sat still for a long time. The robe had saved him, maybe. Or maybe it was just dumb luck. But something about waking up nearly frozen in the one place that was supposed to protect you made the problem feel different, more personal. He got up, hands shaking, and lit a new fire with stiff fingers. The warmth was slow to come, like coaxing a mule from its stall. But as he sat on the stone floor again, the same stone where the coal had landed days before, he felt it once more, that lingering warmth. Not imagined, real. This time, he tested it. After the fire built to a good blaze, he took 4 more stones from outside, flat ones from the creek bed he'd crossed 100 times on trapline runs, and laid them close to the hearth. not in the fire, but near enough to soak in its breath. Then he waited. As the night stretched on, the fire faded as always. But around dawn, Silas reached out and pressed his palm to each stone. Warm. Not hot, but enough to make the air around them less cruel. Enough to mean something. He didn't know why, not yet. But he knew it wasn't just luck. The earth was holding something. Heat. Time. Maybe both. And if a stone could stay warm long after the fire died, maybe that was the key. The thought hit him like a hammer to the ribs. What if the floor could remember the fire? He stood and looked down at the rough dirt that made up the cabin's foundation. Uneven, cold, lifeless. What if it wasn't dirt? What if it was stone? Layered and shaped like a giant hearth, designed not just to support a man's weight, but to hold heat like a buried ember? Silas didn't sleep that day. He sharpened his shovel and started to dig. The shovel bit into the frozen dirt with a dull, resistant thud. Inch by inch, Silas carved a shallow basin into the center of his cabin floor. He wasn't sure how deep to go, only that the floor needed to be something else, something that didn't forget the fire the second it died. The work was slow. His hands, already calloused from trap lines and axe handles, cracked open from the cold. But Silas worked without pause, the rhythm of digging giving his thoughts structure. Every few strokes he'd glance at the hearth, as if expecting it to offer some guidance. It didn't. Just the same fading embers, the same glow swallowed by frost. By the third day, the dirt floor had a wide depression, about 4 feet across, maybe 6 inches deep at the center, sloping gently outward. He dragged in flat stones from the riverbank, chosen for their shape and thickness, stacking them by the door in uneven piles. Each one had to be tested, tapped, fitted. If it wobbled, it went back outside. Only the ones that sat firm and flush would do. It wasn't just about warmth anymore. It was about permanence. One night, as he rested on the cabin bench beside the shuttered lantern, Silas remembered something buried deep in childhood. A cabin back in Kentucky, his uncle's place, far out in the hills, where winters were milder, but the nights just as long. That hearth had been massive, wide as a bed, made of river rock packed with clay. As a boy, Silas would sit there long after the fire had gone out, marveling at how the stone still felt warm against his back. That memory settled in his chest like a coal refusing to go out. He mixed clay with sand and ash in a pine bucket, stirring with a wooden paddle until it formed a thick paste. This he packed between the stones like mortar. It dried slowly, and some nights he had to cover the floor with his robe to keep frost from creeping into the mix. But slowly, the floor changed. By the end of the week, the fire no longer sat alone. It burned in a sunken cradle of stone, each one holding heat like a cupped hand. The floor felt different beneath his boots, solid, intentional, alive. He tested it in secret. Each night he let the fire burn down, then walked barefoot across the cabin in the darkness. It wasn't just warmer. It was radiant. The stones didn't just retain heat, they shared it. He began placing pelts along the outer edge of the stone ring, using it like a slow, steady oven to dry them without scorching. Even rawhide warmed and softened there. He didn't know what to call it. He wasn't building anything revolutionary, just a floor, a better way to keep the cold out. But in the silence of his cabin, Silas began to wonder, what else could stone remember that fire forgot? By mid-February, the cabin no longer felt like a shelter carved from raw necessity. It felt like something grown, something made with intention. The new floor changed everything. But the more Silas watched it work, the more he realized he hadn't gone far enough. The heat held, yes, but only in the center. A wide ring of warmth surrounded the fire pit, maybe 4 feet across. Beyond that, the cabin floor turned cold again, as if the earth could only remember so much. So he kept digging, not deeper, but wider. He expanded the stone bed outward until it reached halfway across the room. This meant shifting furniture, cutting new timber supports to prop the cot, and tool racks. The whole cabin became a construction site, tools and pelts stacked in corners, iron pots dangling from rafters. For weeks, his home was more idea than refuge. Neighbors, if you could call them that, though the nearest trapper was 10 miles west, might have called him mad if they saw it, but no one came. No one ever did. And so Silas worked in silence, one stone at a time. He began layering. Beneath each large surface stone, he packed smaller stones and sand, shaping a kind of thermal bed, one that could absorb heat and slowly push it upward through the layers. He'd never seen it done, but it made sense to him the way tracking did. Follow the signs, trust what the land shows you. Some days, he'd test the floor like a man measuring a storm. Start a fire at dusk, let it burn till midnight, then extinguish it. In the morning, he'd press his hand flat against each quadrant of the floor. Center, inner ring, outer edge. Record what lingered. What he found surprised him. The deeper the layers, the longer the heat lasted. The sand acted like a sponge, holding warmth long after the flame had died. The smaller stones distributed that heat like coals beneath a fire grate. And the surface stones, the flat, river-worn slabs, radiated it gently into the room. He began sleeping through the night for the first time in months. No waking to freeze sharp air. No fumbling with kindling at 3 a.m., just steady, breathable warmth. And every morning his boots were dry, his breath soft in the air, the water in the barrel still liquid. That was the test. If the water stayed liquid, the cabin had truly changed. He stopped stacking as much wood, started using smaller fires. Efficiency bred calm, a stillness he hadn't known in years. The old floor had held him up. This new one, it held him in. And somewhere in those long nights, while the wind battered the world outside and the stones glowed quietly beneath him, Silas Crowley realized something important. He hadn't just built a better floor. He'd built a heat trap, and he wasn't done yet. The day Silas began calling it a heat trap, even if only in his own mind, was the day he stopped thinking like a trapper and started thinking like a builder. Not the kind who raised cabins fast and rough to keep the weather out, but the kind who worked slow, made every layer count, and let no detail go unchecked. The cabin had become his lab. Not by design, survival had forced his hand, but now he approached it like a man solving a riddle, carved in frost and silence. He studied every part of the floor like it held secrets, dug up one corner just to test whether replacing the sand with crushed charcoal might improve retention. It didn't. The charcoal cooled too fast. He tried a layer of animal fat-soaked cloth beneath the stones. That turned the floor into a slow-burning grease fire the first time he got the fire too close. But he kept trying, testing, rebuilding. The breakthrough came by accident. One night, while cooking a hare stew, the heavy iron pot slipped from its hook and landed square on the outer ring of stones. The pot barely dented, but the stone cracked clean in half. And beneath it, the packed dirt was still dry and warm, though the fire had gone out hours earlier. Silas crouched over the broken stone, hand hovering near the dirt. That warmth, still there, waiting, holding on. That's when it hit him. It wasn't the surface stones alone doing the work. It was the layers, the sand, the substones, even the shape of the depression itself. He'd made a chamber, shallow but wide, that trapped heat like a banked ember. Fire warmed the stones. Stones warmed the sand. Sand held that heat like a vault, slow to fill, slow to empty. He rebuilt the outer layer with new stones, larger and flatter. He chinked the seams with clay and pine resin, not just for strength, but for insulation. He tightened the fit until the surface looked like a single, solid platform. Then he made it wider still, nearly to the cabin walls. The hearth no longer felt like a pit. It felt like a core, a quiet, living thing at the heart of his world. He adjusted how he burned wood. No longer high, roaring flames. That was wasted energy. He started building long, low fires, letting the heat soak into the stones over time. Measured, intentional. The cabin changed with it. The air inside stopped swinging from heat to cold. It became even, gentle. Silas no longer rushed to light the morning fire. Sometimes he didn't light one at all until midday. And in that stillness, he found something deeper than comfort. He found control in a world that offered so little of it. Weather, wild animals, loneliness, time. This one thing was his. He had bent the cold to his will, stone by stone, layer by layer. It was early March when the storm hit, sudden, mean, and biblical. The kind of whiteout that stripped the sound from the forest and made every living thing disappear into shadow and drift. Snow came sideways. Wind roared like a broken gate. Trees groaned under the weight of it. And Silas Crowley, for the first time in his mountain life, did not panic. He had seen storms like this before. In his second winter, one had collapsed a neighbor's roof 2 valleys over. In his fourth, a snow load had burst his own cabin door inward, scattering supplies across the floor like dry leaves. But this time, the walls were braced. The roof was double-pitched and sealed tight. And the floor beneath his feet, that stone womb he'd built with frost-bitten hands and river rock, felt like a promise. He built the fire high that morning, not out of fear, but preparation. Split a few dense rounds of larch and pine, and let them burn slow, hot and low against the stone. Then he sealed the door with a heavy crossbeam, checked the shutter on the window, and sat back. The storm howled. Snow piled up outside like sand in an hourglass. He could feel the weight of it pressing against the logs, trying to find a way in. But inside it was still, warm, lit by soft firelight and the slow glow of stone. By sundown, the fire burned down to coals. Silas didn't feed it, just watched. Then he waited. The night stretched on in silence. No wind could reach through. No cold could rise from below. The heat radiated outward from the floor like breath from a sleeping animal. He lay back on his cot, wrapped in a single wool blanket, and listened to nothing at all. By morning, the fire was long gone, but the air was warm. He sat up, boots touching stone that still held the memory of fire. He crossed the cabin barefoot, opened the water barrel. Not frozen, not even a crust. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't magic. It was just the earth, doing what it had always done, holding on. He opened the door. A wall of white greeted him, snow waist-high. But Silas didn't feel dread. He felt calm. That storm, for all its fury, had revealed something no blueprint could show. The floor worked. He didn't need to explain it, didn't care if others believed it. But in that cabin, with the storm howling and the fire gone cold, warmth still lived beneath his feet. And that changed everything. The snow melted slow that spring, reluctant to leave. It lingered in shaded hollows and clung to the north sides of trees well into April. Silas didn't mind. The warmth inside his cabin came earlier that year than any year before. By the time the creeks began to whisper and the frost retreated from the soil, the stone floor had already proved itself through weeks of brutal cold. That would have been enough. More than enough. Silas hadn't built the thing for reputation. He built it so he could sleep through the night, so his water barrel wouldn't freeze, so his body didn't ache each morning like a man twice his age. But news on the frontier doesn't travel by words alone. It travels by changes in the way people survive. It started with a man named Corbin Hale. Corbin was a trapper from 2 ridges east, thin, sharp-eyed, and always half-frozen by the time he reached town. He passed through Silas's area on his way to the trading post, mostly out of habit. That spring he arrived early, teeth chattering, asking if he could rest before continuing on. Silas didn't offer much, just a seat near the hearth, a strip of dried venison, and a place to warm his hands. The fire was low, coals only, but the cabin was warm. not just in the air, but in the bones. That was the part Corbin noticed. "Hell, you burnin' in here?" he muttered, glancing around. Silas shrugged. "Nothing now." Corbin squatted, pressed a hand to the stones. "They're warm." "Yup." He tapped them with his knuckles, then looked up. "How?" Silas didn't answer at first, just handed him a mug of tea and gestured to the layered floor beneath them. Corbin didn't say much after that, but he left an hour later, moving slower than usual, eyes darting around the cabin like he was trying to memorize it. A week later, another trapper stopped by, then a third. None of them had ever been close with Silas, but now they had questions, couldn't stop glancing at the floor, asking about the clay mixture, the stone sourcing, whether it still worked when the fire was low. Silas never made a show of it, never gave a speech, he just answered plainly. Sometimes he'd gesture to the shovel by the door. "Ain't hard to try it yourself." That was all it took. By summer, 2 cabins along the ridgeline had stone floors under construction. Silas helped where he could, not because he needed the company, but because he knew the value of a warm floor. When one man's wife caught pneumonia from a cold snap that came too early, Silas showed up with a load of flat stones already sorted by thickness. Said nothing. Just nodded once and started laying them near the hearth. The knowledge spread like sap through bark. Not fast, not loud, but sure. Trappers began calling it the Crowley floor. Though Silas never used the name himself, he didn't much care for titles, but it stuck. Not because it sounded good, but because it worked. Because men who'd once frozen through the long dark now slept easier. Because the fire could die at midnight, and you'd still feel warmth under your boots at dawn. In the mountains, truth doesn't need advertisement, it just needs to endure. And Silas's floor, stone layered on stone, warmth trapped in the belly of the earth, endured better than anything they'd ever seen. By midsummer, Silas had rebuilt half his cabin's interior, not out of vanity, but necessity. The floor worked, too well, in fact. The rest of the cabin had to rise to meet it. He adjusted the height of the cot, raising it slightly to allow heat to flow beneath. He rebuilt his shelves higher on the wall to keep perishables away from the gentle heat radiating upward. He even replaced the table legs, using ironwood to keep them from warping. The cabin had become more than a home. It was a system now, a living machine that breathed with fire and exhaled warmth. And like any system, it evolved. Silas began logging his work in a rough-bound ledger, not for posterity, but to remember what he'd tried. Each page was filled with sketches, measurements, and observations. Stone thickness, clay mix ratios, the timing of heat loss over nights with no fire. He'd never kept a journal before, but now he feared forgetting something useful, something that might keep another man alive if passed along. He called it Stone Notes. The book stayed near the hearth, wrapped in oilcloth, ink dark as pitch. Sometimes he'd sit on the floor itself, back against the log wall, fingers trailing the stone seams as he wrote. A man might think he was praying. In a way, he was. He experimented with heat direction, added narrow stone paths from the hearth to the sleeping area, built up clay ridges to funnel warmth like a river of breath. On warmer nights, the cabin held steady at comfort without a single flame. It felt like cheating, like he'd reached into the fire, stolen its secret, and kept it long after the flame died. And still, he kept improving. He found that wetting the stones slightly before heating them increased their retention. The water would steam off, but the damp clay beneath helped lock in heat. He tried burying copper coins inside the clay for better conduction. Found they didn't help, but they added a strange metallic smell when warm. He removed them the next day. Everything mattered, every inch, every stone, every mistake. Then came the night he didn't build a fire at all. It had been warm that day, a rare, generous warmth that made the pines smell sharp and alive. The sun had poured through the high window for hours, and the stones, wide open to the light, soaked it in. That night, Silas lit no flame, just walked the cabin in soft steps, listening. The warmth was still there, not roaring, not loud, but present. The cabin never slept. And for a man who'd once feared the night, who'd stacked wood like a bulwark against the dark, this was freedom. Others would come, he knew. They'd build their own heat traps. They'd refine, replace, improve. Maybe one day they'd forget his name entirely. But they'd walk warm floors, and that was enough. The knock came just past dusk. 3 dull thuds against the heavy wooden door, muffled by wind and snow. Silas had been mending a boot by lantern light, his fingers stiff from leatherwork, when the sound pulled him upright. No one knocked out here. Not unless something was wrong. He opened the door slowly, letting in a blast of cold air, and the shape of a man nearly lost inside it. The stranger collapsed across the threshold, boots dragging snow and blood. His coat was torn, one hand wrapped in a bloodied rag, and his face was the color of wax. Silas caught him under the shoulders, half dragged him to the cot, and shut the door tight against the cold. For a moment he just stood there, breath fogging in the lantern glow, staring down at this half-frozen soul fate had dragged into his cabin. "Name's Eli," the man mumbled after a long silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "Storm caught me, lost the trail." Silas didn't answer. He pulled a blanket over the man, set water to boil, and fed the fire a few thick logs. The heat spread slowly, but surely. He saw Eli's fingers twitch as the warmth of the floor began to rise. "You're lucky," Silas finally said. Eli laughed once, dry and sharp. "Don't feel lucky." "You will by morning." Silas didn't explain why. He didn't speak of the layered stone beneath them, the system hidden in plain sight. But he watched Eli's body soften with every passing hour. The cabin, as it had done so many nights before, held the warmth like a promise. By midnight, Eli was asleep. By morning, his color had returned. They spoke more the next day. Eli was a prospector, new to the range, thought he could beat. The snow line backed to a distant claim and got turned around. He'd been without fire for nearly 2 days when he stumbled across the smoke from Silas's chimney. "I thought I was done," Eli said, holding his hands near the hearth. "I've slept beside fires. I've built them in caves, tents, under trees, but this floor—" He tapped it with his boot. "This floor feels like it's alive." Silas gave the smallest of nods. "Made it that way," he said. He opened the ledger, showed Eli the pages, rough sketches, notes, half-formed equations scrawled between hunting observations and tool repair lists. Eli listened, really listened. And before he left 2 days later, wrapped in a new coat Silas insisted he take, he said something that stuck longer than any praise. "I'm going to build one, not just for me, for the folks coming after." Silas said nothing, but he watched the man disappear into the trees with more than a stranger's hope in his heart. Silas Crowley never wrote a book, never claimed to be an inventor, never carved his name into the beam above his door or stamped his mark on anything he built. But long after he was gone, the warmth remained. His cabin stood for years after his passing, tucked in a quiet bend of the high timber country where wind whispered through pine and stone. Trappers passed it, prospectors used it, homesteaders stayed a night or two before moving on. Each left a mark, but none tore it down. They called it Crowley's Place, even if they didn't know the story. Inside, the floor never changed. Stone upon stone, fitted so precisely that time itself couldn't find a way in. Fires burned, coals cooled, and still the floor held the heat. Some travelers spoke of it like magic, others like memory. It became a quiet place on the trail, a known haven when storms rolled in. People left bundles of firewood by the door. One left a Bible, another a child's carved wooden horse. No one stayed long, but none forgot the feeling, waking in the morning with warm breath, warm boots, and no fire burning. Years later, a family from the south settled nearby, built their home on the next ridge over. They'd heard of the stone floor and came to study it. The father took notes. The eldest son copied the pattern in his own cabin. They wrote the principles down, added sketches, and passed them to neighbors. That was how it spread. Not through invention, but survival. Through gratitude. Some said the method reached as far as Oregon. Others saw hints of it in trading post bunkhouses and frontier schoolrooms. Modified, adapted, but all was built on the same truth, that warmth didn't need to be loud or fast or fed constantly. Sometimes it just needed to be held carefully and given space to endure. Silas's grave was a mile from the cabin, marked by a smooth stone and a single word carved deep, Crowley. No dates, no epitaph, just a name. But for those who ever stepped foot inside that cabin, it was enough. The warmth told the rest. And when travelers knelt by the fireless hearth, boots resting on stone that remembered the sun, they didn't need to be told whose hands had built it. They could feel it, in the floor, in the silence, in the warmth that outlived the man who gave it shape.